Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your patience, and welcome to Dante. You know what Dante would say? Put your faith in God Almighty, not in Microsoft Windows. The title of today's lecture is Poetry and Eternity. Dante represents really the pinnacle of the literary culture of the Catholic Middle Ages in Europe. And his topic is eternity, final things. So it's very fitting that this is the final lecture for CVSP 205. So thank you for your attention and good luck on the exam. I wish you all the best. I'm joking, of course. This is, however, an example of an artist's representation of the final scene in Dante's poem. I'll be talking about its structure a great deal, but I'll just sort of begin with this image, which is of the final perfected harmony of the highest heaven, being watched by these two little shadowy figures there. You can see sort of two very close together. That's Dante, and the other figure is his guide to paradise, the Paradiso, Beatrice. I'll say a little bit about Beatrice today, but more about the other guide, Virgil. Here's a rough plan of the lecture, and I apologise in advance that to make up for time, I'm going to go very fast. By all means, shoot up your hand and get me to clarify something if you have a question. The fly sheet I won't be referring to, you can put it aside, but it has the major quotations and diagrams that I'll be putting up on the slideshow, and you can discuss aspects of that in more detail in your discussion sections. Beginnings and middles. I'll be talking a little bit about the start of the poem and about Dante's relationship to middle things. But my main presentation will be to talk about Dante as uniting dual principles. In the first instance, unifying Christianity, that is the theology and philosophy of the Catholic religion, and antiquity, that is classical antiquity, the world of Greece and Rome that, of course, you've encountered in certain texts at the beginning of this course. And Dante's poetry is, in a sense, an embodiment of this, the prestige and the authority of the classical past. I'm going to talk about the poem as having a structure and a narrative. Structure is what is sort of the overall organisation that you can stand back and represent as a diagram. Narrative is, of course, the process of actually going through the poem, which is what you're going to be doing as readers. Since you're readers, I will say a few words about what reading was like in Dante's age and Dante's own theory of reading, which may be a useful guide to your own reading. And then a little bit more about Dante's political context. I have a feeling we might be doing sort of short shrift with this last section, but there is some material on the handout, and you can also cover this in your discussion sections. How does the poem begin? It begins with probably the most famous midlife crisis in recorded history. Midway along the journey of our life is Dante's first line. And what happens to him midway along the journey of his life is a spiritual crisis that is going to be the subject of this poem. Dante lived in the city of Florence, now in modern Italy, in the region of Tuscany. His life straddled the 13th and 14th centuries, and you probably know the sort of biblical shorthand for the proverbial length of a human life, 70 years. A score is 20, so 70 is 70. This means that if you take a very sort of mathematical look at one's life, midway means the year 35. I'm a 35-year-old, so I relate to this poem especially deeply this year. I hope nobody else in the audience is midway along the journey of their life. You all look pretty safely in the first quartile or so. Anyway, if we take 35 as representing, Dante's idea of his own midpoint, it helps explain why he sets the drama of his poem in the year 1300. Kind of a nice round number, seems to give it a certain significance, a certain gravity. Additional gravity and additional religious resonance is given by setting the action of the poem over the 3 days of Easter in that year. This is a sort of buried detail. He doesn't sort of announce, it was the year 1300. This is a little clue for you to enjoy or to have pointed out to you by a dull lecturer. But it suggests what I'll be referring to again later on, the very artful management of number, proportion, harmony that goes throughout this work. The year 1300, that puts us in what is normally called the Middle Ages. Do you think Dante referred to his own age as the Middle Ages? Why not? Exactly, it's modernity as far as he's concerned. It's a construction of later historians, and I just want to stress this point that it is a construct. Medieval and the Middle Ages is often used in a sort of pejorative or condescending way to mean that, culture and technology weren't very advanced, people were sort of obsessed with theology and so forth. Well, maybe that's a little bit of a reduction, a little bit of a cartoon. I think reading Dante's poem, you'll get really struck and impressed by the depth and the resonance of themes that you will be able to relate to in modern literature and in modern life. Nevertheless, here are the two traditional headings that I want to set out the structure of the poem under. The classical headings that you might sort of keep in mind as you think through what Dante is doing are on one side, the Christian on the other. It's a little bit artificial. Again, I'm making a construct for you to help understand a poem that is very long and very rich in specific details. As readers, encountering a poem probably for the first time, it's that experience of encountering the details and the narrative that is crucial. This is background that you might keep in mind and that you might modify or qualify based on what you actually encounter in this poem. Nevertheless, as a rough first pass to the structure of the poem, Dante is attempting to unite reason, roughly the discourse of philosophy, of which you've had examples in this course, and the discourse of theology. What is the place of the divine, and so on. A question is emerging in this corner of the room. Yes, what did you want to say to me? Oh, you were talking amongst yourselves. Please don't do that. Classical reason and philosophy, represented by Aristotle as the sort of pinnacle, the highest point, the summation. He's called in the poem the master of those who know. On the other side, the sort of pinnacle or the representative of theological thought, St. Augustine, the Bishop of Hippo, author of Confessions and City of God. I've also put the name of St. Thomas Aquinas underneath Augustine. His great intellectual project in the Middle Ages in Paris was to synthesize, that is, bring about an intellectual consistency between the philosophy of Aristotle and the theology of the fathers of the church represented by St. Augustine. So another very important influence on Dante. On the literary side, Virgil was the pinnacle of classical poetry. His great text was the Aeneid, an epic poem consciously modelled on the poetry of Homer, which tells the story of the founding of Rome by Aeneas, who was on the losing side of the Trojan War. So he and a bunch of plucky Trojan refugees wandered the Mediterranean for several years, rather like Ulysses does in Odysseus, I should say. I used the Latin version of the name, Odysseus in the Odyssey, and then arrives at Rome and founds the great imperial state. Virgil is a character in this poem of Dante's. He takes a historical author associated with the most valued literary performance of Roman antiquity and makes him not only a character, but his guide to reality, to the spaces of the afterlife that he is going to wander through in this poem. And there's one point where you get an idea of the sort of ego that Dante, as a poet, might have had. This is a moment, you can see it's in the fourth canto of the Inferno, where he encounters the great poets of antiquity, Homer, Ovid. Virgil normally hangs out with him, but he's sort of, he's doing a bit of a holiday accompanying Dante. And Dante lets the reader know, a greater honour still they deigned to grant me. They welcomed me as one of their own group, so that I numbered sixth among such minds. You know, there's no sort of modesty or shame in the face of the greatness of classical antiquity. Dante just tells you straight up, I'm the equal of these guys. The idea of political life as potentially an expression of justice and harmony, things that exist on the divine side and that are part of God's plan, is important to Dante's biography, as I hope to touch on. In the poem, it's represented by the city of Florence, his city of birth, but also a city from which he was exiled. This is the sort of key biographical event of Dante's public life. He was part of a factional struggle in the city-state of Florence, in which he was on the winning side at first and received quite a high post in the government of Florence. However, his faction broke into two more factions and he was expelled from the city for life, never allowed to return. His was the life of an exile, and this was a shattering experience to him. So the phenomenon, the human experience of not being able to return home is a sort of counterpoint or contrast in the poem to the city of God, where justice is final, ultimate, where everybody has their place, where rewards are given to the deserving. So that's another contrast to bear in mind. And down the bottom, I've mentioned again the two guides who are going to escort Dante through his tour of the afterlife. Virgil for the Inferno and the Purgatorio. Beatrice, and again, I'll just have to leave Beatrice for you to discover in your discussion sections for Paradise. Do you happen to recognise the illustrator of this example? It's a little bit obscure, maybe. This is one of William Blake's famous watercolour illustrations of the Divine Comedy that he did around the year 1800. And this is the first moment of the poem. Virgil, who's doing this rather odd static pose of someone running away, he's in red. He's woken up midway through the journey of his life. He's found himself in a dark wood, and 3 wild beasts have come to block his path so that he can't follow the rising sun in the background. What is he going to do? Fortunately, rescue is at hand, and here is the classical poet Virgil, who looks perhaps a little bit different to what you might expect a Roman author to look like. It's a little bit more like a sort of angelic figure. Anyway, that's the figure who's going to say, "Don't worry, Dante. I understand you're having a crisis, but if I show you what permanent reality, what the afterlife is like, then you'll understand how to live your life rather better." And Dante, unlike the Dante who says, I was welcomed by Virgil and Ovid and Homer, is a little bit reticent at first. He says, "I'm not Aeneas, I'm not Paul." And I've put up the headings classical and Christian again, because this line very nicely condenses Dante's habit of pairing up a classical reference with a Christian reference. Aeneas, the hero of the Aeneid, of Virgil's poem, who makes a trip to the underworld in that poem, in Book 6 of the Aeneid. And St. Paul, who has a vision of the afterlife which is described in his epistle to the Hebrews. Okay, I'm just going to have to whip through this very quickly, so you won't have much thinking time. This is the first quiz question for you in 205. Here's another of Blake's illustrations. Up here, Dante and Virgil sketched out in pencil. Can you make out the figure of a human being inside this tongue of flame? Can you sort of see that? Take it from me. There's a person inside there. It's somebody who you may have encountered before. Does anyone happen to know? I would be, I admit it, rather surprised if you did, but who knows? Okay, let me give you a much easier illustration so you can guess who this person is. Who's that? Yes. This is Odysseus. Obviously, he's putting out the Cyclops Polyphemus's eye here. Here, he's stuck in a tongue of flame in hell. It's a rather surprising place to find Odysseus, isn't it? I mean, doesn't Odysseus conquer everything? At the end of the Odyssey in Book 24, who's in hell? It's people like Antinous and Melantho, not the great epic hero who has restored political order. But maybe you know another story about Odysseus, the story of the Trojan horse. The Trojan horse that brought down the IT infrastructure of Troy and left it vulnerable to attack. That's the Odysseus that Dante consigns to the afterlife, where he lives forever in the circle of the treacherous, of people who committed sins of fraud. So there he is working on stories. I'm just going to have to skip over this, I think. I'd like to show you Odysseus's words. I'll leave them for you to discover at another time. And this slide is just an illustration of 10, and I could have easily made this 20, 20th century and 21st century translations just into English of Dante's Divine Comedy. So both visual artists and poets and translators continue to be extraordinarily inspired by Dante's work to produce their own original work or to bring it to audiences. I think Mark Muse's translation or an example of one of these is there. Maybe not. Maybe the translation that you're using by the great US Dante scholar Mark Muse didn't even find space on this slide. Very well, let's move on to the second organising principle that I'm going to introduce to you, and that is the balance or the cooperation between structure, how the poem is organised as a totality, and narrative, how you proceed through the poem as a reader. On the side of structure, and a lot of this I've sort of indicated already in my commentary, and it's probably familiar to you from the reading you've begun to do, or references in your classes. So let me just whip through this. The structure of the afterlife is organised into three spaces: hell, purgatory, and heaven. There are further subdivisions. As I said, Odysseus is found in the circle of the fraudulent. So hell is organised into 9 circles, each of which corresponds to a sin that the individual committed in life. So you have people who committed sins of wrath, people who were murderers, people who were corrupt, and so forth. People who played Candy Crush in lecture. You know, that's everyone's got their own place. And the punishment that they suffer in hell is matched to the qualities of the sin for which they are guilty. So the wrathful, for example, just hurl stones at one another through afterlife. They're sort of having this sort of constant mud fight, and so on and so on. Purgatory is organised into terraces. Unlike the circles down which you descend in a spiral, the terraces you rise. And purgatory is in fact the only part of Dante's system that has movement, that has a principle of dynamism inherent in it. Purgatory is not a permanent resting place. It's where souls do penance for so-called venial sins, forgivable sins, which are organised the same way as the sins that are punished permanently in hell. But unlike those mortal sins, commission of which condemns you to permanent life in the inferno, venial sins can be worked out through time. Lastly, there are the spheres of heaven. The principle of unity that organises this structure of the universe is divine love, as Dante says. And love incorporates here the idea of justice. You should not feel pity for the souls that you encounter in hell. They deserve it. You know, it's really an expression of love that such people should be consigned to where they are, just as is an expression of love to elevate the souls of the blessed, of the virtuous, into the spheres of paradise. That's the position that Dante the poet wants you to have. A question, thank you, yes. Absolutely a fair question. I agree with you, and furthermore, this issue is actually played out in the poem. Let me just bring up the next side. The very last distinction I'm drawing is between Dante the poet, who organises this system, and Dante the pilgrim, who is the character that we follow through the poem. Dante the pilgrim walks through the inferno and constantly feels pity for the souls he encounters. Dante realises that this is an extremely natural instinct. You see somebody in pain, you see somebody whose life you can understand, and it really affects him. There are times where he faints. So this claim that it's actually an expression of divine love is a challenging claim. It's a very difficult claim to understand intuitively. It's something that, we either grant Dante in order to read his poem in the manner that he wrote it, or that we resist and test the difference between how we feel about these issues and how they are presented in Dante's poem. Is that sort of enough of a comment for now? Yeah, well, thanks very much for the question. Great question to put to your instructors, of course. What else do I want to say on the side of narrative? So was there another question? Sorry. Fine. On the side of narrative, the poem is organised into 3 parts called canticles. Sort of large poetic phases that correspond to each of the 3 parts of the afterlife. And these have the titles Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso. Each canticle is divided into 33 cantos, with one bonus canto for the introduction, so that the total is nice round number, 100. The cantos themselves are divided into lines grouped by threes, which are called tercets. And there's another three, we can sick of them already. The rhyme scheme rhymes groups of 3 lines by end word. But they're not consecutive lines, it's every second line. I'll show you an example in a little bit just to make that clearer. This is called terza rima. It's a poetic technique invented by Dante in this poem. And again, it just keeps hammering you with an organisation into threes. What is often remarked is that this is something of a gesture, a rather distant gesture, at the idea of the Trinity at the centre of Dante's Catholic theology. The principle of unity for the narrative is the journey of Dante the Pilgrim, as he moves sequentially, first guided by Virgil, then guided by Beatrice, through the landscape of the Inferno and the space of purgatory, and I guess you would say the space-scape of paradise, the heavenly spheres. Here's a much sort of easier to grasp diagram of that. The cone of hell, where Dante and Virgil are proceeding on the interior surface of that cone. They emerge after going through the centre of the earth and climb the mountain of purgatory, and then they launch off into the heavens, eventually leaving the spheres that contain the planets and reaching the Empyrean, the very highest heaven, from which Dante and Beatrice have that vision of all of the angels organised into a sort of harmonic rose that I illustrated at the very beginning. A little sort of footnote about Dante's picture of the earth. His idea for why hell and purgatory should look like cones is that they were created when the archangel Lucifer, thereafter Satan, was expelled from paradise for his rebellion. And he sort of flew like a meteor and hit the earth down there where hell opens up. And his momentum drove him like a drill into the centre of the earth. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction, so as he hollows out and compacts the earth, so the mountain comes up on the other side. It's brilliantly efficient. The engineers in the room will be very impressed with this method of construction. Most of the reading that you have for this final couple of weeks concentrates on the part of the text in the middle, the Purgatorio. So I've also included on the handout this diagram that shows what Dante and Virgil encounter as they proceed up the mountain of purgatory. There's the shoreline where souls arrive after death. There's a sort of waiting room, the Valley of the Princes, and then purgatory proper begins with its 7 terraces. On each terrace, you sort of work out, you do penance for one of the 7 capital vices, as they're called, or one of the 7 deadly sins, though expressed in venial form, if you're lucky enough to make it into purgatory. So again, reading from the bottom up, Dante encounters people doing penance for pride, envy, wrath, sloth, greed, avarice, gluttony, and lust. And at the very, very top of the mountain is the earthly paradise, where Dante will be, he'll be given a nice bath in the waters of Lethe. It's a classical river, another example of Dante taking a Christian structure and allegorically finding a place for a key classical ingredient. The waters of Lethe. Does anyone happen to know the mythology of Lethe? What? Yes? It is, yes, and it has the special property that... Exactly. The special property of erasing your memory. So that's what happens when you get to the top of Mount Purgatory. It's like your slate is cleaned. And Dante undergoes this experience, even though he is still alive and will be returning to life on the surface of the earth after this experience. He receives this cleansing so that he can proceed up to paradise. Here is a good, and I'm not sure if I actually put this on the handout, so you might want to just make a note of Canto 17, lines 91 to 102. This is where Virgil explains the structure of purgatory in a very sort of neat and convenient form to Dante. And he explains it. He explains the phenomenon of vice in terms of desire. And venial sins represent desire that is somehow faulty, because the individual being has either had too little or too much, or has directed it towards the wrong sort of object, towards food or towards money or whatever. Again, no time to read given the late starting point, but there's a key reference for you. This is an illustration, just for interest, of the terza rima structure that I referred to before, and my rather hard-to-follow verbal description will suddenly become clear if you follow the colours. See how there are groups of 3 lines that rhyme in the Italian? So, for example, oscura, dura, paura, forte, morte, scorte. This is how the terza rima cooperates with the tercets, that is the arrangement into groups of 3 lines. The translation of Michael Palmer manages to reproduce the terza rima effect in English, which is a notable challenge because the incidence of rhyming in English is much less than in Italian. A map of Florence. I'm not going to go into any sort of detail about politics in Dante's age. Suffice to say that the 2 key cities for his life are Florence with the Red Star and south of Florence on the Tiber River, Rome. Rome being both the ancient imperial capital, and so the site of classical culture, but also, of course, the centre of the religious life of the Middle Ages, where the Pope had his residence. So Rome is used as a sort of metonymy, as we would say, a sort of reference point where a part represents the whole, a metonymy for classical imperial greatness and for the centre of religion. Dante wrote before the Divine Comedy a number of shorter texts. One of the texts is called De Vulgare Eloquentia, which has a delightful quality of being an appeal for writers to use their native tongues instead of the classical language Latin. But in order to reach a scholarly elite, he wrote the text in Latin. So it's a Latin text saying you should write in Italian, which of course he did in the Divine Comedy itself. There are a few biographical touches, and here's a couple of them referring to this phenomenon of exile that I said was such an important part of Dante's life experience. The experience certainly affected his view of his fellow Florentines. When he mentions Florence in the poem, the tone really gets pretty red hot. Here you'll see the tone shift from sarcasm to condemnation. Be joyful, Florence, since you are so great that your outstretched wings beat over land and sea, and your name is spread throughout the realm of hell. You should be proud. Look how many Florentines I've met while I've been going around the inferno. Well done, you're famous. I was ashamed to find among the thieves 5 of your most eminent citizens, a fact which does you very little honour. But if early morning dreams have any truth, and will have the fate, you will have the fate, in not too long a time, that Prato and the others crave for you, and were this the day, it would not be too soon. Would it had come to pass, since pass it must. The longer the delay, the more my grief. You can see he really adopts a very prophetic voice in parts of the poem like this, sternly condemning and even mocking his contemporaries, but also saying, you know, it's all going to end pretty badly for you. I will have the last laugh. Here's the very last thing that I want to include in this lecture. We'll just really zip through everything after this to get to the end on time. But I want to pause on this text, which is part of a letter Dante wrote to a noble called Can Grande, who was one of his patrons. He gave Dante a livelihood after he was expelled from Florence. And here Dante is talking about how to read deeply. When you encounter a text that has real philosophical or theological significance, says Dante, there are 4 levels of approach that you can take, which he calls literal, allegorical, moral, and anagogic. And he gives an example from one of the Psalms of the Hebrew Bible. When Israel went out of Egypt, the house of Jacob from a barbarous people, Judea was made his sanctuary, Israel his dominion. Now, says Dante, if we look at the letter alone, that is, if we look at the surface, the literal meaning, what is signified to us is the departure of the sons of Israel from Egypt during the time of Moses. If at the allegory, what is signified to us is our redemption through Christ. And you can see here clearly this is not reading Hebrew scripture from a Jewish perspective at all. That might be the literal level, but he is saying we can go to what he would call the Old Testament and discover an anticipation of Christian themes. And that's a style of reading that's called typology, a word I've just stuck in parentheses there. That is finding a Christian sense in the Old Testament. But there are 2 more ways as well. If at the moral sense, what is signified to us is the conversion of the soul from the sorrow and misery of sin to the state of grace. As you're probably thinking, we seem to have moved a long way from the story of the Exodus. Suddenly, Moses has completely disappeared. All characters have disappeared completely. There is just a moral signification of the passage of the soul. Rather an important idea to Dante, of course, as it's the journey and the encounter of souls that makes up the body of his Divine Comedy. Finally, the anagogic, where what is signified to us is the departure of the sanctified soul from bondage to the corruption of this world into the freedom of eternal glory. So, material life, life on earth ceases to matter. There is a permanent destination. I like that example as an introduction to the Purgatorio, because the theme of the Exodus is raised a number of times. So when they're sort of standing on the shoreline when they first arrive, very conveniently a ferry is coming in that's bringing some new souls who are going to go through purgatory. There's a couple of illustrations. Again, one rather sketchy watercolour by Blake, and one not dissimilar illustration by Salvador Dali. So this boat arrives, and the people on it are singing a hymn, and the hymn is about the Exodus. No time for quiz 2, move on. Dante recognises, as is often the way when he encounters souls in this poem, he recognises one of the souls on this ferry, and they are also talking about the Exodus. So you can see the connection between theory and practice in Dante's art. You'll be very interested to read about Marco and free will. I won't do it for you, but again, you might want to note Canto 16 as an important one. There's a rather beautiful illustration by Doré. This is the very last slide, so if you can pause 30 seconds, we'll be done. There's Beatrice bathing Dante in the waters of the Lethe so he can be purified and head to heaven, where he will have the final vision of eternal harmony. Here's a much more abstract, artistic rendering corresponding to the one we began with. So, thank you very much for your attention. Good luck for the rest of the semester.